Good morning. There's a bit of an echo up here. Just excuse me for half a tick. I do this every time, don't I? It's really good to be back. I've been away on a holiday for a week and then away with the pastors for a week, both times at Fraser Island. It was tough to be me for the last 2 weeks. Yeah. Actually, I want to say this. It sounds like a really good time to go and hang out on a beach with a bunch of pastors. We have about 70 pastors in this conference, and we were all staying in a public campsite called Cathedral Beach, and each night we would go down to one of the little barbecue areas, and Pastor Foot would bring his guitar and would all sit around and would all sing. Not secular songs, they were praise songs, and random strangers in the car park, in the caravan park would come up and what are these blokes doing? What's going on over there? We had international tourists with the backpackers and the tour buses coming through, and they would have a bit of a wander in. Pastor Sean Berkeley was just preparing his meal, and there was a couple that had come to Cathedral Beach to renew their 20-year anniversary, renew their vows. They had brought everything with them, their wedding dress, their safari suits, and they had all of the bridesmaids and all of the bridegrooms and all of like they had the families all there and the kids were there and all this, and they realized just before the service that they had forgotten the celebrant. And they wandered over into our camp, hearing that there were 70 padres hanging about, and they said, "Can anyone do it?" And Sean's like, "Yeah, I'll do it." So Pastor Zenny, Pastor Million, and myself were making tea, and next minute all we can hear is Sean saying, "Now do you?" That's coming across the entire campground. The opportunity to be sold out to Jesus is so easy when you just live your faith as a natural thing. And to actually be part of that and to witness other men who have been ministers for years just embrace the opportunity that is at hand is an amazing thing to witness and a hugely uplifting thing for me personally. On the Thursday as we're leaving the island, we started a game of volleyball at Eli Creek. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever been to Eli Creek. It's a beautiful freshwater creek. It's kind of cold in comparison to the ocean. But it's so fresh and so clear and so lovely, and you can float down this creek, and it comes out and it sort of broadens out to be about the width of the centre aisle here. Well, a little bit wider than that, probably the width of the chairs. And there's probably about 30 or 40 backpackers have turned up in a bus, and here are us mob of yobbos called pastors playing volleyball and hooting and screaming and carrying on. And very organically, these backpackers joined in. And toward the end of it, as we're all breaking up, because we actually had to go home, and that was quite sad. But Pastor Zenny was talking to 4 guys, and I walked past just to hear him say, "No, really, I am a pastor." And they said, "But you're not old and boring." There is something joyful about being a Christian, am I right? There is something deep-seated in ourselves once we actually connect with Christ, that there is something that the world does not understand, and we're told that they will actually hate us for it because we're actually happy and they're not. You notice that? There's something deep in your heart. It's interesting. By faith, when Moses had come of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Refused. When he walks into Pharaoh with Aaron, he walks in as the legitimate heir to the throne of Egypt. When God calls him out of the wilderness, we're told in Exodus, when God calls him out of the wilderness, he simply is the legitimate heir to the throne of Egypt, and the Pharaoh has died. So him going back to Egypt, even though it seems okay, even though it seems perfectly legit, he goes back and his presence itself claims the title to the throne of Egypt. But he refuses the title. He refuses the puppet king. And it's really interesting if you go to Genesis. I know we're supposed to be preaching in Exodus. I know I started in Hebrews, now I'm going to Genesis. I'm a bit confused. If you go all the way back to Genesis, you get the original lie. You will be like God. If you eat this fruit, you will be like God. What is the lie about that? Interestingly enough, there is no lie in that statement because we were already like God. We were made in his image. The deceiver twists the concept that we're missing something, but we were already made in his image. But here, God says to Moses in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1, God says to him, "See, I have made you like a god to Pharaoh, and your prophet is Aaron." It's an amazing statement. When you fully understand what Pharaoh and how he thought about himself, here is this guy who could potentially usurp him from his throne anyway, walks into the throne room and is now viewed as a god by Pharaoh. And here's the issue. People worshipped Pharaoh as a god. It's a confusing little part of the tale, isn't it? Now you've got almost the clash of the titans, if you want to go Greek on it. But Moses doesn't do that. I like to imagine some of this scene in my head because Moses doesn't do the talking. That's Aaron's job. I get the feeling Moses walks in and he's sort of like, oh, this could go one of two ways, but I'll just go in and send Aaron. You go and do the talking, son. You'll be right. You'll be fine. And Moses sort of stands up the back. And Aaron's just about to say, let my people go. And he looks back to Moses. Moses is over here and he gives a nod, and then Aaron does all the talking. And that's the way I picture it, like this really quiet guy who just seems very quiet but very knowledgeable. You know what I mean? And there's this intrigue by Pharaoh. And so initially they cast the rod down. Aaron casts his rod down and Pharaoh says, well, that doesn't confront me. And he turns to his magicians and he says, you guys just whip out your staves, throw them down, and they all turn into snakes. You're a god, I'm a god. Let's just check this out. Whatever you can do, I can do. Then Moses looks at Aaron, and Aaron looks at his staff, and his staff becomes alive, and it eats up all the other sticks that the magicians threw down. The game of chess begins. There's something about this. It's all done by faith. I want to go back to that original thing. By faith, Moses, when he was growing up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. Didn't want it. He had a legitimate claim to it and chose not to take it because there was a joy he found in the wilderness. There was a joy he found away from the glitz and glamour of Egypt's royal palace. And he found it in the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of his fathers, the God of his mother who said, this is a fine child, and put him in the Nile, but not the way she was supposed to, but put him in a little boat. He found peace there. And it seems that he gets the raw end of the deal when he goes out to the wilderness because, well, quite frankly, who wants to go and live in a desert when you can live in a palace? It seems he gets the raw end of the stick. But he finds joy. And he gets a bit confused when he gets asked to go and do some stuff for God. And it's really interesting. I want to use that term, go and do stuff for God. Go and do some work for God. It's a bit of an issue. You see, when he goes into Pharaoh, he actually says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go that we may serve the Lord in the wilderness." Now the NIV translates this as worship. And we interchange these words, worship and serve, but if you actually go to the Hebrew, Yah Abda, and I'm probably pronouncing that particularly poorly, but that word itself can be translated, and has done many times in the Old Testament, as to toil or to work. So Moses and Aaron rock up to Pharaoh's throne and they go, "G'day mate, how you going? Let our people go so they can go and do some work for a different God." That's literally what they said. They never asked them to go and worship some other foreign god. They simply said, "We are going to work, we are going to take the labor supply that you have for free, and we're going to go outside the boundary of your country, and we're going to work for a different god." Now remember, Pharaoh himself believes he is a god. But they have many gods. Does anyone know what the god of the Nile was called? Happy. I thought that was funny when I read that. You go to the Nile and get happy. Maybe not. When you're not in denial, you're happy? Oh, I don't know. There's too many bad puns in that one. But there is a thing about the plagues that come. There is a thing about the plagues that come, where Yahweh is talking to both Israel, his chosen people, and he is talking to the Pharaoh of Egypt. He initially desires that the Pharaoh would actually do exactly as he says without sending a single plague. But knowing full well that the Pharaoh has convinced himself that he is one of the gods and that he has a direct connection, he has been deceived so much that he will never twist his eye toward the God of heaven. He is convinced in his sorceries. He is convinced in his dark arts. He is convinced. And so God sends the first plague. And the first plague hits the God happy. I want you to go back just a little bit. And we've covered this last time I preached. At the age of, any child under the age of 2 was told by the Pharaoh that they must toss their child into this river because Israel was too prosperous and they might overthrow them. So take your baby, take your child that you love and sacrifice it, willingly or unwillingly, to this God happy. That is really what the Pharaoh had asked. Now you'll notice that as we go through these plagues, and I'm only going to look at the first 3 this morning, but as we go through these plagues, you'll notice that most of the time Pharaoh's going down to the river. You see, happy is the God of life. Happy is the God that brings life to all of Egypt. He is the reason wealth occurs in Egypt. He is the reason that all things happen. He is the God of fertility. And if you actually really look at the hieroglyphics, you will find that happy is given both male and female parts. And he was revered, unlike the other gods, like Ra-Amon, the sun god, and I can't remember it all, but these gods were revered, but not in the same way. There is no actual cult directed and dedicated specifically to Happy because all the other gods don't exist without him. And so the other gods are the ones that pay tribute to Happy. So understand that in Egypt mythology. All right? Understand exactly where Happy fits into this. And Yahweh says, this is whom my firstborn has been sacrificed to. He refers to Israel as his firstborn. And the first plague turns this river to blood. And to every pool or every spring that is in Egypt turns to blood. And the river that is meant to bring life, Yahweh proves, is indeed a river of death. This is where you have sacrificed my children. As an Israelite mother, put yourself in the shoes of an Israelite mother looking at that river, symbolically showing the blood of their children. Understanding that this God happy, well, he's not happy anymore. He has no power over Yahweh. There is nothing he can do to stop the death within his stream. And who he really is has been displayed for all to see. Imagine being an Egyptian looking at this God of gods, unable to change back the clean flow of water from the stinking stench of blood. When Yahweh says, I am for you, even though you're living in the plague, believe me, he is still for you. You may not feel it, you may not see it immediately, but he is for you. He's not holding back the promise. And as an Israelite mother, as an Israelite father, seeing this, they start to remember the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. They start to recall the promises that were made. They start to see this and they start to really understand that Yahweh cares, Yahweh was watching, and he certainly was not absent. It was an interesting experience last week on Fraser as we get to the next plague, which is the frogs. I found out that Australians may actually be ethnically Egyptians. I was enlightened on cane toading. Apparently that's a common thing up here in Queensland, am I right? Yeah, that's an interesting one. But you see, frogs came up out of the same river that give life to ensure that we know that Happy has been defeated in this plague. Let us then provide a plague from him a second time. And that's these frogs. These frogs come up and they get everywhere. Now, I don't know, who here likes frogs? Well, there's like 3 hands. Like, there you go. Or 4. I'm okay with frogs. I really am. But out there. I'm not okay with a frog in my food. All right? I'm not okay with frog in my drinking water. And I'm certainly not okay with a frog in my bed. I mean, Kermit the Frog's kind of cute, but even still, he's still not getting in there. But you see my point. These frogs come up and they become a pest and they become more than they can handle. And it's fascinating. It's fascinating. You see, Pharaoh, who hasn't got the message after the defeat of Happy, hasn't got the message because he still believes that he is a God, even though he goes down every morning to worship Happy and to sacrifice to Happy and to appease Happy. He still hasn't got the idea that Yahweh is in control from start to finish. He still hasn't got the idea. And so he hardens his heart against Moses and Aaron, and he says, I'm not going to let you go. And the frogs come. But they come when he goes down to the river, and Aaron and Moses are waiting for him. And Aaron just touches the river with his staff, and the frogs appear. Now, Pharaoh being Pharaoh says, well, this doesn't confront me. So he goes to his sorcerers and he says, look, seriously, we have some amazing dark arts here in Egypt. We're all aware of it. Knock yourselves out. Show us what you can do. And so what do? They conjure up more frogs. I'm not sure that was helpful. Now, stop and think about this. You have a plague of frogs. You have all the Egyptians coming to Pharaoh saying, get rid of these frogs. You have all of the Israelites going, why are we living with these frogs? And they turn to Pharaoh because they can't really comprehend what's going on with Moses and Aaron. So they turn to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh turns to his sorcerers, and all they do is make it worse. Notice that no relief ever comes from the pagan king. If I turn this to a personal thing for myself, watching my older brother, he became enslaved to drugs. And when he went to AA, or more accurately NA, all he did was found a new dealer. The first time, all that happened was the guy who was running the program was also selling the poison. There is no relief if you only go to a pagan king. There is no respite from the plague that is currently in your life if you just go to the world for help. And then he begs Moses to get rid of these frogs. And they finally pile them up. And their stink remains. But still Pharaoh, being Pharaoh, and still thinking of himself as a god and not wanting to lose his free labor source. He obviously was a good accountant, by the way. Free labor source, that's gold for production, right? Not wanting to lose this, he hardens his heart. And he says, I will not let the Israelites go and work for a foreign god that I do not know. And Moses and Aaron, a little bit disappointed, wander back down. And this time it's got nothing to do with the Nile. We know the Nile has no hold on Yahweh. But if I take you back to Genesis, when God created man, he got down and he drew in the dust. And this time he says to Aaron, strike the dust. And as he does so, the dust becomes gnats. Basically the same substance of what we were created from becomes a plague of insects. And there is no separation between the Egyptians and the land of Goshen, where my people live, as it comes in the next plague. But in this plague, there is no separation. So get this, the guys that brought it, Moses and Aaron, they also live in it. They also experience it with God's people. By faith, Moses chose not to be the son of Pharaoh's daughter, but to suffer with God's people. He even brought suffering that he lived in. And again, Israel is watching. And again, the Egyptians turn to Pharaoh saying, what can you do? And he turns to his dark sorcerer guys and he says, look, you guys could at least produce some frogs. What are you going to do this time? What are you going to do? And they get together and they conjure up a potion or whatever they did and they wave some sticks in the air, or I don't know what they did. I'm just making stuff up now. And pretty much they made nothing. They could not create out of the dust. They could not create anything, because creation, that is simply Yahweh's realm. You want something to live and breathe out of the dust? You need to go to the God of heaven They could not make the plague worse, and they could not alleviate it. And Israel's watching. And Israel's remembering. And you can see the nation of Israel starting to remember its roots. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. The God of Joseph, who brought them into Egypt. And you can see them as collectively starting to earn the trust, or providing their trust, more accurately, to Moses and to Aaron, knowing that they are obviously connected to the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There is this beautiful story of Yahweh himself letting them know initially, yes, I remember you, and I remember your children that were cast aside for no valid reason other than I blessed you. And I wept with you. And I know that you've seen the dark arts of Egypt. I know that while you've been here, you have seen all of this nonsense that has been going on with these pagans who are sacrificing to their gods, their multiple gods. I know that you've seen this, and I know they've got trickery and spells and other things. I want to say flashing lights, but I don't know that they actually had them. Don't be taken away and awed by all the magic that is going on out there. Because when I produce, whatever they come up with is going to seem like a cheap trick. My uncle was a magician. My uncle in New Zealand is actually a radio announcer. He was quite famous a few years back. And he had a morning show in Wellington. But he also had this magic act that he travelled the country with. And he had these rocks, these really fantastic rocks. He would pick them up and he would... And then he would throw them at you. And they were foam. People would duck and dive away from it, and these things would bounce. Everyone laughed. That's pretty much all the sorcerers could come up with, an illusion. They could not actually compete with a God who creates, a God who gives life and sustains it, a God who chose the people of Israel to come out of Egypt, to come away from the pagan setup, simply because this was his firstborn. And he understood the pain and the suffering of the mothers. He understood the pain and the suffering of the fathers who watched it helplessly, knowing they could do nothing. And you see the love of God in these plagues. He consistently provides a way out for Pharaoh. It's interesting as you get to the end, and I'm not going to jump into it. I highly recommend for Sabbath reading, if you have small groups and you're studying through the book of Exodus, I highly recommend you just go through the plagues one by one in your small groups. It's a fascinating read, and it will enrich your life as you simply see the hand of God working to pull Pharaoh away from what he now believes to be that he is a God. And as you go through it, you come to the very last little bit. And God actually gives the recipe for forgiveness, not just to the Israelites, but to the Egyptians, if anyone sprinkles the blood. If you just believe. And in the Exodus, even Egyptians go because they actually believe in the signs and the wonders that they have seen. They actually notice that Yahweh has an authority unlike any other God. It's interesting, when Jesus comes, he speaks as one who has authority. Amen. There is no difference between the way he works in the Old Testament and the way he teaches in the Gospels. There is an authority that is deep-rooted because God is who he is. He says, I am who I am. And it is by faith, it is simply by faith that Moses was able to step out and claim the rightful position of being called by God, rather than the wrong position of being the heir to a pagan kingdom. It is by faith that we step out of the material world around us to followers of Christ. Amen. It is by faith that we wake up in the morning and put on our shoes and go downstairs, do whatever we do. It is by faith that we literally pray. It is by faith that we eat our food after grace. It is by faith that we walk outside and we're not worried about the war between the good and evil. Amen. It is by faith that we realize that if God is legitimately for us, there is not a single force in this world that can indeed be against us. It is by faith that a whole bunch of pastors sit on a beach and sing songs at the top of their lungs, ministering to random strangers. It is by faith that we as a church serve our community. It is by faith that we as a church stop worrying about what is against us, but worrying about who we can serve, who we can toil for, who we can work for, knowing that Yahweh is going to bless that work, that toil, and whatever we put our hand to. It is by faith that we know he will come again. And that hope is real. That hope is real. We have no care, no fear, because it's all by faith. And when that faith is deeply rooted in the God who remembered the children tossed randomly to a pagan god, when he cares for the mother, when he cares for the father, when he cares for the children, by faith we can stand tall. Our last song is "'Tis So Sweet to Trust in Jesus." And I want to put this to you as a challenge over the next week. There are things in your life that are going really well. Trust in Jesus to make that better. There are things in your life that aren't going so well. Trust in Jesus to actually turn your mind back to him so that what you see is no longer the plague that is presenting itself, but the face of Jesus. Turn your eyes to him, and he will bless you in ways that you cannot imagine, in ways that I can't tell you.